Welcome back to the pack. Today's story is an absolute emotional roller coaster, and I can't wait for you to hear it. Before we let the drama unfold, make sure to mark your territory by hitting that like button and claiming your spot in our community by hitting subscribe. I'd like to know where my pack members are scattered around the globe, so drop a comment below telling me what country or city you're listening from. And as we go through the story, if a scene makes you gasp or swoon, pause and timestamp it in the comments. I want to see exactly which moments hit the hardest. Now let's break down that door. Tonight was supposed to be her salvation, the one night where status and cruelty held no sway over fate. But she was trapped, hidden away like a shameful secret. Miles away, amidst the celebration, the Lycan king paused. He stopped mid-breath, his golden eyes narrowing as a phantom scent drifted on the wind. A scent he had hunted for weeks. He did not know her name, and he did not know her face, but his beast knew exactly where she was, and he was coming for her. Chapter 1. The Girl in the Shadows. The grand estate of Lady Ingrid bustled with a chaotic energy that vibrated through the floorboards, but Beth felt none of the excitement, only the familiar ache in her scrubbed raw hands. Servants scurried past her with armfuls of silk and velvet, their eyes averted as if looking at her might somehow tarnish their own standing. Beth remained on her knees in the foyer, polishing the obsidian tiles until her own pale, exhausted reflection stared back at her. Tonight was the mating ceremony, the single most important event in the shifter calendar, yet she was being worked harder than a pack mule. Her stepmother had ensured that every corner of the manor gleamed for the guests who would stop by for pre-ceremony drinks, guests who would never know that the former Alpha's daughter was the one wiping the mud from their boots. Lady Ingrid swept into the hall, her presence commanding the immediate silence of the room. She was a tall woman, beautiful in a sharp, icy way that made one think of winter storms and frozen lakes. Her gaze landed on Beth, and a sneer curled her painted lips. She did not speak immediately, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable for everyone present. Ingrid kicked the bucket of soapy water near Beth's leg, sending a slosh of gray liquid over the girl's ragged skirt. Beth did not flinch. She had learned long ago that reacting only invited more pain. She simply grabbed her rag and began to soak up the mess, keeping her head bowed in submission while her wolf paced restlessly in the back of her mind, whining for a freedom that felt like a distant dream. Celia, Ingrid's biological daughter, entered the room a moment later, looking breathtaking in a gown of shimmering emerald silk. Unlike her mother, Celia's eyes held no malice, only a deep, terrified sorrow as she watched Beth cleaning the floor. When Ingrid turned her back to shout orders at the kitchen staff, Celia dropped a small, wrapped bundle of bread and cheese near Beth's bucket, masking the movement with the swirl of her heavy skirts. It was a small mercy, but in this house, small mercies were the only fuel Beth had to keep going. They exchanged a brief, silent look, an acknowledgement of their shared prison, though their cages were built of very different materials. Celia was the prize pony to be sold to the highest bidder, while Beth was the stain to be hidden away. The tension in the house had been building for weeks, ever since the rumors began that the Lycan king himself would be in attendance tonight. The king's presence changed everything. It made the air vibrate with a terrifying potential. Beth remembered the terrifying encounter she had survived only a month prior, an event that she kept locked in her heart. Ingrid had forced her out into the treacherous northern ridges of the Packlands, demanding she find a specific patch of wild bluebells that grew only on the cliff edge. The stepmother had claimed she wanted the flowers for a centerpiece, but Beth knew it was merely a game to see if the girl would slip and fall to her death. While clinging to the rocky face, gathering the fragile purple blooms, the wind had shifted violently. A massive presence had moved through the trees below her, a predator so large the birds fell silent. Beth had pressed herself into the moss, her heart thundering, the scent of crushed petals and rain clinging to her skin. She had never seen the beast, but she had felt its power, a primal force that made her own wolf sing with a strange, terrifying recognition. She had fled back to the estate with the flowers, shaking and breathless, unaware that the wind had carried her scent down to the predator below, marking her in a way she could not scrub off. Now, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the foyer, Beth finished drying the tiles. She stood up, her joints popping, and clutched the dirty rags to her chest. For the first time all day, a dangerous spark of hope ignited in her chest. The law stated that every unmated wolf of age must attend the ceremony. Even Ingrid, with all her malice, could not defy the royal decree without risking her social standing. Beth would go tonight. She would stand in the back, invisible and silent, but she would be there. And if the moon goddess was kind, a mate would find her, claim her, and take her away from this house of torment forever. Beth, Ingrid's voice sliced through her thoughts, sharp as a whip crack. The older woman stood at the top of the stairs, looking down with eyes that gleamed with a disturbing mixture of amusement and malice. Don't bother changing yet. There is one last thing I need you to fetch from the old annex before we leave. It seems I have misplaced the brooch your father gave me, and I believe it is in the storage chest there. Beth's stomach twisted. The annex was a ruined building on the far edge of the property, cold and isolated. But stepmother, the carriages are arriving in 10 minutes. I won't have time to make it back and dress. Ingrid smiled, a slow, predatory expression that sent a chill racing down Beth's spine. Then, you had better run, hadn't you? Chapter 2. The King's Obsession. King Michael paced the length of his private study, his heavy boots making no sound on the thick woven rugs that covered the stone floor. The room was a sanctuary of shadows and leather, filled with the scent of old parchment and the lingering metallic tang of weapons oil, but tonight, even this familiar space felt like a cage. He stopped before the high-arched window that overlooked the sprawling Capitol, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Below him, the city was alive with lights and movement, a flowing river of torches and carriages making their way toward the ceremonial hall. It was a night of celebration for his people, the beginning of the mating ceremony, but for Michael, it felt like an impending execution. His wolf was prowling just beneath his skin, agitated and snarling, scratching at his ribs with a restlessness that had not abated for weeks. The source of his torment was a phantom scent that had haunted his every waking moment since the last full moon. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, trying to summon the memory of it. It had happened during a solitary hunt along the treacherous northern ridges, a place few dared to tread because of the sheer drops and unstable shale. He had been tracking a rogue bear that had wandered too close to the borders when the wind had changed, carrying something that stopped him dead in his tracks. It was not the smell of prey or blood. It was delicate, complex, and utterly intoxicating. A blend of wild bluebells, fresh rain, and a hint of warm vanilla. It was the scent of his mate. He had abandoned the bear instantly, his beast taking control as he tore through the underbrush, desperate to find the source. He had scrambled up the rock face, his claws digging into the stone, pushing his body to its absolute limit. But by the time he reached the ledge where the scent was strongest, she was gone. All that remained were a few crushed stems of the purple wildflowers and the lingering essence of her fear. She had been there, terrified and alone, and he had missed her by mere minutes. Since that night, he had scoured the kingdom.
He had sent trackers to the northern villages, attended every social gathering, and walked the streets of the capital in disguise, hoping to catch that fragrance on the breeze again. He had found nothing. Now, the council expected him to choose a mate from the high-ranking females presenting themselves at the ceremony tonight. The thought made his stomach churn with revulsion. The women of the court were all the same, drenched in cloying, artificial perfumes that stung his nose, their smiles practiced and their ambitions naked in their eyes. None of them possessed the wild, pure essence of the female he had missed in the woods. His wolf rejected the very idea of them. pacing in tight circles within his mind, snapping its jaws at the thought of settling for anyone else. Michael turned away from the window, pouring himself a glass of amber liquor with a hand that shook slightly from suppressed energy. A knock at the heavy oak door broke his concentration. His beta, a stern man named Kane, entered with a respectful bow, though his eyes betrayed his concern. The car was ready to take the king to the hall. Michael downed the drink in one burning swallow and set the glass down with a sharp click. He adjusted the cuffs of his formal jacket, the fabric feeling constricting and unnatural against his skin. He would go to this ceremony, because it was his duty. He would sit on his throne and watch the parade of hopefuls. But his beast was already making a silent vow. He would search every corner of that hall, inspect every single wolf in attendance. If the owner of that bluebell scent was there, he would find her, and if she was not, no law or counsel would force him to choose another. He opened the door and strode into the hallway, his face a mask of cold authority, while inside, his wolf prepared for the hunt. Chapter 3. The Gilded Lie. Beth scrubbed the last smudge of soot from her cheek, her hands trembling as she stood in the center of her tiny, drafty attic room. The space was barely large enough for her narrow cot and a cracked wash basin, a stark contrast to the opulent suites on the floors below. But tonight, the cramped walls felt like they were closing in on her. The house was a whirlwind of shouting voices and the heavy thud of trunks being moved, but up here, there was only the sound of her own ragged breathing. She had finished the impossible list of chores Ingrid had set for her, every muscle in her body aching from the exertion, but she had done it. She had earned her right to attend. The door creaked open and Celia slipped inside, closing it softly behind her. The younger girl looked like a vision from a storybook, her emerald gown catching the dim light of the single candle Beth had been allowed. In her hands, Celia clutched a bundle of fabric, her eyes darting toward the hallway as if she expected her mother to burst in at any moment. She rushed to Beth, unfolding the bundle to reveal a dress of deep midnight blue. It was simple, lacking the jewels and embroidery of Celia's own gown, but the silk was soft and clean. It was an old dress of Celia's that she had altered in secret, taking in the waist to fit Beth's slender frame. Beth ran her fingers over the cool fabric, a lump forming in her throat. For years she had worn nothing but rough wool and discarded servants' clothes. To wear something so beautiful felt like a dream. Celia helped her into the gown, her fingers working quickly to fasten the buttons at the back. When Beth turned to look in the small clouded mirror, she barely recognized the girl staring back. The dark blue brought out the depth of her eyes and contrasted with her pale skin, making her look not like a servant but like the high-born daughter she had been before her father's death. For the first time in years, she looked like herself. Celia grabbed a brush and began to work through Beth's tangled hair, smoothing it into loose waves that fell over her shoulders. They worked in silence, the bond between them speaking louder than words. Celia was terrified of her mother, but her love for Beth was the one rebellious flame she refused to let Ingrid extinguish. Celia whispered that Beth looked beautiful, that tonight would be the night everything changed. She spoke of the beta she had been eyeing from afar, a man named Alaric, and the hope that he would claim her before her mother could sell her off to a stranger. Beth listened, her heart aching with a mixture of happiness for her sister and a desperate clawing need for her own salvation. Beth did not dream of the king. The stories of the Lycan monarch described him as a terrifying, distant figure, a warrior made of shadows and blood. She did not want a king. She simply wanted a mate who was kind. She wanted a home where she was not afraid to speak, a table where she was allowed to eat, a bed that was warm. If she could just find someone, anyone, who would look at her and see a partner rather than a burden, she would be the most devoted mate in the kingdom. The sound of a carriage wheel crunching on the gravel drive below snapped them out of their reverie. The girls shared a panicked look. It was time. Celia squeezed Beth's hand, her fingers cold, and promised to stay close to her at the hall. They crept out of the attic and down the back stairs, moving like ghosts through the house they both feared. As they reached the grand foyer, they saw Ingrid waiting by the open door, wrapped in white furs, checking her reflection in the hallway mirror. The older woman turned as they approached, her eyes scanning Celia with critical approval before sliding to Beth. Her expression did not change, remaining a smooth mask of indifference, but there was a glint in her eyes that Beth did not trust. Ingrid gestured for them to hurry, her voice deceptively light, as the carriage driver waited to take them to the night that would decide their fates. Chapter 4. The Trick. The evening air was crisp and carried the distant rhythmic pounding of ceremonial drums, a sound that vibrated through the soles of Beth's worn shoes as she stepped out onto the gravel driveway. The carriage stood waiting, a massive black structure drawn by 4 restless horses, their breath pluming in the twilight. Celia was already climbing inside, her emerald skirts rustling like leaves, but as Beth moved to follow, a hand clamped down on her shoulder. The grip was hard, the fingernails digging in painful crescents through the silk of her borrowed dress. She froze, the familiar rush of adrenaline flooding her system as she turned to face her stepmother. Ingrid's face was a mask of sudden theatrical distress. She pressed a hand to her chest, her eyes widening in mock horror as she patted her bodice and the folds of her furs. She gasped, announcing loudly enough for the driver to hear that she had forgotten her grandmother's silver brooch. She turned her gaze on Beth, her voice dripping with false panic. She claimed she had left it in the old storage chest in the annex earlier that day, when she was inspecting the inventory. She could not possibly appear at court without it. It was a symbol of her family's lineage. She thrust a heavy iron key into Beth's hand and ordered her to fetch it immediately. Beth hesitated, glancing at the carriage where Celia was watching with wide, fearful eyes. The annex was a quarter-mile away, a crumbling stone building on the edge of the dark woods. Weaving through the overgrown path in the dark would take time. She pleaded with Ingrid, pointing out that they were already running late, that the opening speeches would be starting soon.
She offered to run back into the main house to check Ingrid's vanity instead, desperate to avoid being separated from the group. But Ingrid's grip tightened, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous hiss that only Beth could hear. She warned Beth not to make a scene, threatening that if she didn't retrieve the brooch, she would be left behind entirely. The threat was effective. The fear of missing her one chance at freedom outweighed her suspicion. Beth grabbed the key and turned, hiking up her blue skirts and sprinting into the gathering darkness. She ran as fast as her legs would carry her, the wind whipping her hair across her face, branches snagging at the delicate silk of her dress. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she navigated the uneven path, her mind focused solely on the task. Get the brooch, run back, get in the carriage. She could not miss the ceremony. She could not spend another night in this house. She reached the annex, a dark, looming silhouette against the navy sky. The heavy wooden door groaned as she unlocked it and pushed it open. The interior smelled of damp earth, rot, and stale air. It was pitch black inside. Beth stepped over the threshold, feeling along the wall for the lantern she knew was kept there. Her fingers brushed the cold metal, but before she could strike a match, a sound from behind her made her blood run cold. It was the distinct, heavy scrape of the exterior deadbolt sliding into place. Beth spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She rushed to the door, grabbing the iron handle and twisting it with all her might. It refused to budge. The heavy oak was solid, immovable as a mountain. She realized with a sickening jolt that she had not heard footsteps following her. Someone had been waiting here in the shadows, or perhaps the door had been rigged to lock from the outside. She shouted for help, her voice cracking, but the estate was too far away, the servants busy in the main house, and the carriage driver likely deaf to anything over the sound of the horses. She was alone in the dark, and the silence that followed was heavier than the stone walls surrounding her. Chapter 5. The tiny window. Panic was a cold, sharp thing that lived in Beth's chest, expanding rapidly until it choked off her air. She threw her weight against the door again and again, ignoring the bruising impact on her shoulder and the stinging pain in her hands. She screamed until her throat was raw, calling out for Celia, for the gardener, for anyone who might be lingering on the grounds. But the annex was built like a fortress, designed generations ago to store grain and valuables, its walls thick enough to muffle even the most desperate cries. The silence of the woods swallowed her screams, leaving her panting and trembling in the oppressive darkness. She fumbled in the dark until her hands found the matchbox she had dropped. With shaking fingers, she struck a light, the sudden flare illuminating the dusty, cobweb-filled room. There was no chest. There was no brooch. The room was empty save for a few broken chairs and piles of old sacking. It had been a lie from the very beginning. Ingrid had never intended to take her to the ceremony. The cruelty of it was so precise, so calculated, that it stole the strength from Beth's legs. She slid down the rough stone wall, the blue silk dress pooling around her like a puddle of spilled ink on the dirty floor. High above her, near the vaulted ceiling, was a single narrow window. It was too small for her to crawl through and far too high to reach, but by dragging one of the broken chairs over and standing on her tiptoes, she could just barely see out. The view twisted a knife into her heart. Miles away, across the dark expanse of the Packlands, the royal ceremonial hall was a beacon of golden light. She could see the tiny, moving specks of carriages arriving, the glow of torches lining the grand entrance. It looked like a world made of fire and warmth, a world she was banished from. As she watched, a streak of light shot up into the sky above the hall, exploding into a brilliant shower of red and gold sparks. The fireworks. The signal that the king had arrived and the ceremony had officially begun. Tears blurred her vision, hot and stinging, spilling over to track through the dust on her cheeks. Every explosion of light in the distance felt like a mockery. Somewhere in that hall, her potential mate might be waiting. He might be looking for her, sensing a pull he couldn't explain, only to find nothing but empty space. She imagined him giving up, turning to another, claiming someone who wasn't trapped in a cold, dark box on the edge of nowhere. Beth pressed her forehead against the cold stone of the wall below the window. The hope that had sustained her through the day, through the years of abuse, flickered and died. She was not Cinderella. There was no fairy godmother coming to unlock the door. There was only the damp smell of mold, the aching silence, and the knowledge that she had been erased. She curled into a ball on the floor, pulling her knees to her chest, and wept silently, mourning the life she had been so close to touching. Meanwhile, miles away in the center of that golden light, the heavy double doors of the great hall swung open, and the Lycan king stepped into the gathered crowd, his eyes scanning the room with a terrifying intensity. Chapter 6. A Scentless Hall. The Grand Hall was a cavernous masterpiece of architecture, its vaulted ceilings lost in shadows while thousands of candles floated in glass orbs, casting a warm, golden glow over the assembly. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, saturated with the mingled scents of over 1,000 wolves. It smelled of spice, musk, expensive perfumes, and the underlying electric tang of anticipation. To any other wolf, it was the scent of potential and celebration. To King Michael, as he strode through the massive double doors, it was an assault on the senses. The noise of the crowd died down instantly, replaced by a hush of reverence and fear as the pack bowed low, a sea of bent necks acknowledging the apex predator in their midst. Michael moved with a lethal grace, his black ceremonial cloak billowing behind him like smoke. His face was impassive, a mask of royal indifference, but beneath the surface, his senses were working overtime. He inhaled deeply, dissecting the air with surgical precision. He catalogued the floral notes of the southern duchesses, the woodsy colognes of the warriors, the nervous sweat of the unbonded youth. He searched for the one note that mattered, the wild bluebells, the rain, the vanilla. He filtered through layer after layer of scent, his wolf prowling at the forefront of his mind, ears pricked and nose twitching. He walked down the center aisle, his golden eyes scanning the faces of the women who dared to peek up at him. Nothing. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The scent was not here. He reached the dais and ascended the steps to his throne, turning to face the crowd. From this vantage point he could see everyone, the glittering nobility in the front, the humbler pack members in the back. He expanded his senses, pushing his awareness to the very corners of the room, hunting for even the faintest trace of her. His beast let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated in Michael's chest, a sound so deep it was felt rather than heard by those closest to the throne. The disappointment was bitter and sharp, tasting like ash in his mouth.
He sat on the obsidian throne, gripping the armrests until the stone groaned under the pressure. The ceremony required him to find his mate first, to lead by example. The crowd waited, breathless, for him to descend and make his choice. They expected him to pick one of the groomed, polished daughters of the High Council. They did not know he was looking for a ghost. Michael watched the hopeful expressions in the crowd and felt a surge of irrational anger. Why was she not here? Had she rejected him? Was she dead? Or had his senses lied to him in the woods? No. His wolf knew she existed, and her absence tonight felt like a personal betrayal by fate itself. Chapter 7. The King's Decree. The silence in the hall stretched thin, turning from reverent to awkward. The musicians hesitated, bows hovering over strings, unsure whether to play the mating anthem. The council elders exchanged nervous glances, shifting in their velvet seats. The king had been seated for 5 minutes, motionless as a statue, his gaze fixed on the back doors as if willing them to burst open. The tradition was absolute. The alpha pairs first. Until Michael moved, no other wolf could seek their mate. The tension in the room was palpable. Young wolves were vibrating with the need to find their partners, their instincts screaming at them, but fear of the king held them frozen in place. Michael felt the collective anxiety of his pack. He felt their longing, their suppressed hope. It clawed at his empathy, warring with his own selfish desire to burn the world down until he found her. He looked at the faces in the crowd, young men and women trembling with the need to touch the person destiny had made for them. He realized with a heavy heart that holding them hostage to his own misfortune was the act of a tyrant, not a king. If he could not have his happiness tonight, he would not deny them theirs. He stood up abruptly. The movement caused a ripple of flinches across the front rows. Michael raised a hand, demanding silence before anyone could speak. His voice, when it came, was deep and projected to the furthest corners of the hall without the need for shouting. The moon goddess works in mysterious ways, he began, his tone flat and devoid of the joy the occasion demanded. Tonight, she has chosen to keep my own fate veiled. My mate is not among you. A collective gasp swept through the room, followed by hushed whispers of shock. An unmated king was a vulnerable king. However, Michael continued, his voice hardening to cut through the noise. The happiness of the pack is the strength of the pack. I will not let my own shadow darken your light. He stepped forward to the edge of the dais, looking down at the sea of faces. I hereby waive the ancient law of primacy. The ceremony will proceed. Find your mates. Claim your joy. He gestured sharply to the band leader. Play. As the music erupted and the crowd broke into relieved, chaotic movement, Michael sank back onto his throne. He felt hollowed out. He watched the joyous reunions, the sudden sparks of recognition as eyes met across the room, the laughter and the tears. It was a torture to witness what he had been denied. He signaled for a servant to bring him wine, strong wine. He would sit here and endure this festival of love as his duty required. But inside, a dark, dangerous storm was brewing. His wolf was done waiting. If she wouldn't come to him, he would tear the kingdom apart stone by stone until he dug her out. Chapter 8. The Beta and the Bird. The hall transformed into a swirl of color and sound as the formal constraints of the ceremony dissolved. Wolves moved through the crowd guided by instinct, the air filling with the unique energetic hum of bonds snapping into place. Near the edge of the noble circle, Celia stood stiffly beside her mother. Ingrid was gripping her daughter's elbow, whispering harsh instructions on how to posture herself to attract a high-ranking alpha from the Northern Territories. Celia was barely listening. Her heart was pounding, her eyes darting through the crowd, searching for a specific face she had admired from afar for months. Then she saw him. Alaric, the pack beta, was moving through the throng, his broad shoulders clearing a path. He wasn't looking at the high-born ladies parading themselves. He was looking straight at her. Their eyes met, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. It wasn't just attraction, it was a profound, resonating sense of rightness. The noise of the room faded into a dull roar. Celia felt a pull in her chest, a golden thread connecting her heart to his. She took a step forward, unconsciously pulling her arm from her mother's grip. Alaric stopped a few feet away. He was breathless, his eyes wide with wonder. "Celia," he breathed, as if testing the name for the first time. The recognition was mutual and instantaneous. The mating bond didn't care about politics or dowries. It simply was. He extended a hand, palm up, a silent question, and an offer of devotion. Celia didn't hesitate. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed his. The spark that jumped between them was visible, a tiny arc of static that made them both gasp. Ingrid was momentarily distracted by a duchess missing the initial connection. Celia and Alaric stood locked in their own universe, grinning like fools. Alaric, emboldened by the bond, gently pulled her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles. "Mine," he whispered, the traditional greeting of a mate. "Yours," she replied, tears of relief springing to her eyes. They turned together toward the dais. The custom was to approach the throne and receive the king's blessing to finalize the union. They began to walk, hand in hand, blinded by their happiness, unaware of the viper coiling to strike behind them. Chapter 9. The Rejection. They reached the base of the dais, joining a line of other happy couples waiting for the king's nod. Michael sat above them, his expression grim, but nodding mechanically to each pair. When Alaric and Celia stepped forward, the king paused. He knew Alaric. He trusted him with his life. A flicker of genuine warmth touched Michael's eyes. He saw the way his beta looked at the girl, as if she hung the moon and stars. Michael leaned forward to offer his blessing, opening his mouth to speak the ceremonial words. "Halt!" The shriek cut through the air like breaking glass. Lady Ingrid shoved her way through the crowd, her face twisted in a rictus of fury. She positioned herself between the couple and the king, her chest heaving. "I forbid this," she announced, her voice trembling with rage. The hall went silent. To interrupt a mating blessing was a grave insult bordering on treason. Michael's eyes narrowed. "You forget yourself, Lady Ingrid. The bond is sacred. It is not yours to forbid." Ingrid drew herself up, smoothing her furs, regaining her icy composure. She turned to the court, pitching her voice so the gathered nobles could hear. "The bond may be sacred, Your Majesty, but the law of betrothal is binding. My daughter," she gestured to a terrified Celia, "is already promised to Alpha Thorn of the Eastern Drift. A contract was signed 3 months ago. It was a blatant lie. There was no contract, only Ingrid's ambition, but she played the part perfectly." She turned a look of withering scorn on Alaric. "A beta cannot break a blood-signed union with an alpha. It is a matter of hierarchy. If he pursues this, he insults our house and breaks the social accords." Alaric went pale. He looked from Ingrid to Celia. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice rough.
Celia opened her mouth to scream that it was a lie, but Ingrid's hand clamped onto her wrist, digging into a pressure point that sent a wave of paralyzing pain up her arm. Ingrid's eyes bored into her daughter's. promising retribution not just for her, but for Beth back home if she spoke out. Celia crumbled. She looked down, tears streaming freely, unable to deny it aloud. Alaric took her silence as confirmation. He looked at the king, agony written on his features. He was a soldier. He lived by the code of hierarchy and honor. He could not steal another Alpha's betrothed without causing a pack war. He slowly let go of Celia's hand. I withdraw, he choked out. I will not dishonor the pack. He stepped back, bowing low to the king, then turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped as if carrying the weight of the world. Celia let out a sob, but Ingrid was already dragging her back into the crowd, hissing at her to compose herself. Chapter 10. The Run. Michael watched the scene unfold with a simmering fury. He knew Ingrid was lying. He could smell the deception rolling off her in waves of sour sweat. But without proof or a denial from Celia, he could not intervene in a civil dispute. The injustice of it clawed at him. He had watched his best friend's heart break in real time, orchestrated by a woman whose ambition poisoned the air around her. The hall, once a place of celebration, now felt stifling, a cage of gold and velvet. The noise of the resumed music grated on his nerves like sandpaper. The smell of perfume was choking him. His wolf was thrashing against his ribs, demanding release. The beast was furious at the king's inaction, furious at the missing mate, furious at the cruelty he had just witnessed. Michael couldn't breathe. He stood up abruptly, knocking over his goblet of wine. The red liquid spilled across the stone like blood. He didn't care. Enough, he growled to no one in particular. He descended the stairs, ignoring the courtiers who tried to bow or catch his eye. He moved with a speed that blurred the edges of his vision. He needed air. He needed the cold bite of the wind. He needed to run until his lungs burned and his muscles screamed, until physical exhaustion drowned out the emotional chaos. He burst through the side doors of the hall and out into the cool night. The moment his boots hit the grass, he let go. He didn't bother stripping off his royal clothes. He leaped into the air, his body contorting and expanding, bones snapping and reshaping in a fluid, practiced agony. He landed on all fours, a massive wolf of midnight black fur, standing nearly as tall as a pony at the shoulder. He threw his head back and let out a roar that wasn't a howl. It was a challenge to the moon itself. Then, he ran. He tore into the earth with massive claws, sprinting away from the lights, away from the music, away from the responsibilities of the crown. He ran without a destination, letting his pure instinct drive him. He headed west, skirting the edge of the dense forest, running aggressively and fast. He didn't know it, but his subconscious was steering him. He wasn't running away. He was circling. The path he cut through the night was an arc that would lead him inevitably toward the residential borders, toward the source of a sorrow that matched his own. Chapter 11. The Breaking Point. The silence inside the stone annex was a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to press against Beth's skin, growing heavier with every passing hour. She had long since stopped pounding on the reinforced door, her fists bruised and throbbing from the futile effort against the iron-bound oak. The adrenaline that had fueled her initial panic had drained away, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache that settled deep in her marrow. She sat curled in the corner furthest from the drafty entrance, her knees pulled tight to her chest, trying to preserve what little body heat she had left. The darkness was absolute, save for the single, mocking square of moonlight that filtered through the high window. A window too small to crawl through and too high to reach, offering only a sliver of the world she was denied. Through that cruel aperture, she could no longer see the fireworks, but she could feel the distant vibration of the celebration. It was a rhythmic thumping in the earth, the collective heartbeat of the pack rejoicing in the mating ceremony. Somewhere out there, wolves were finding their other halves, bonds were snapping into place, and lives were changing forever. Here, in the damp solitude of the storage room, Beth was being erased. The dust on the floor coated her tongue, and the smell of stale grain and mildew filled her nose, a stark contrast to the imaginary sense of the banquet she had hoped to attend. Her stepmother's plan had been perfect in its simplicity. No one would look for the servant girl. No one would notice she was missing until the ceremony was over, and by then, her chance at freedom would have evaporated into the night. Time seemed to distort in the darkness, stretching and warping until minutes felt like hours. Beth's mind began to wander, drifting into dangerous territories of despair. She thought of her father, of the life she had before he passed, and the slow, agonizing descent into servitude that followed. She thought of Celia's terrified eyes as the carriage pulled away. The isolation began to chip away at her human resolve, stripping back the layers of civilized restraint she had worn as armor for years. Deep inside her chest, something shifted. Her inner wolf, a creature that had been beaten into silence and dormancy by years of trauma, began to stir. It wasn't a gentle awakening. It was a violent, clawing need to surface. The atmosphere in the annex suddenly changed, charged with a strange, static energy that made the hair on Beth's arms stand up. It was as if the air pressure had dropped before a massive storm. She didn't know it was the proximity of the Lycan king raging miles away. But her wolf felt the ripple of dominance rolling across the land. The beast inside her responded to that power, pushing against her ribcage with a sudden, overwhelming urgency. The grief of the night, the years of pain, and the crushing weight of the locked door combined into a volatile mixture that demanded release. Beth scrambled to her feet, her movements jerky and uncoordinated as the animal instinct took the driver's seat. She staggered to the center of the room, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The walls felt like they were shrinking, closing in to crush her. She needed to be heard. She needed to break the silence before it swallowed her whole. She threw her head back, her eyes squeezing shut against the tears that leaked out, and opened her mouth. The sound that tore from her throat was raw and primal, bypassing language entirely. It started as a low moan of misery but climbed rapidly into a piercing, melodic howl that vibrated through the stone foundation. It was a soul song, the cry of a wolf who had lost everything, a beacon of pure sorrow launched into the night sky, pleading with the moon for an answer. Chapter 12. The Turn. The forest blurred into a tunnel of shadows and gray shapes as King Michael tore through the underbrush, his massive paws churning the earth with lethal force. He was running blindly, driven by a cocktail of fury and disappointment that burned like acid in his veins. Branches whipped against his black fur, and the cold wind stung his eyes, but he felt none of it. He was a creature of pure kinetic energy, needing to punish his own body to silence the roar of rejection in his mind. He had left the ceremony behind, left his duties and his people, unable to bear the suffocating stench of perfume and pretense for another second. He needed the wild. He needed the silence of the hunt.
He had been sprinting for nearly an hour, his trajectory taking him in a wide, erratic arc along the perimeter of the residential estates. He pushed his muscles to the breaking point, seeking the burn of exhaustion that would drown out his thoughts. His wolf was snarling in his mind, a constant, abrasive presence that demanded he turn back, that he keep searching, that he tear the kingdom apart, stone by stone. Michael ignored the beast, focusing only on the rhythm of his stride and the rush of the ground beneath him. He was running away from his fate, convinced that the moon had played a cruel joke on him by letting him catch a scent he could never find again. Then, the sound hit him. It didn't travel like normal noise. It cut through the atmospheric interference like a physical projectile. It was a howl, faint with distance but heavy with an emotion so profound it stopped his heart for a fraction of a second. It wasn't a challenge, and it wasn't a rallying cry. It was a sound of absolute desolation, a frequency of grief that resonated with the very emptiness he had been trying to outrun. Michael's wolf slammed on the brakes, his claws digging deep furrows into the soft loam as he skidded to a violent halt, his massive chest heaving. He stood frozen in the center of a small clearing, his ears swiveling, straining against the wind. The howl had faded, but the echo of it lingered in his soul, pulling at him with an invisible tether. Slowly, painfully, the wind shifted. It blew from the direction of the cry, carrying with it a fragile, complex aroma that hit Michael with the force of a sledgehammer. First came the sharp, sweet tang of crushed wildflowers, bluebells. Then, the clean, mineral bite of fresh rain. And finally, underneath it all, the warm, soothing note of vanilla. The realization hit him instantly, shattering his anger and replacing it with a singular, terrifying focus. It was her. She wasn't a ghost. She wasn't a figment of his imagination. She was real, and judging by the sound that had just ripped through the night, she was in agony. A low growl started in his chest, building until it shook his entire frame. The king pivoted on his haunches, his golden eyes narrowing as he locked onto the direction of the scent. He launched himself forward, but this was no longer an aimless run. This was a hunt. He exploded into speed, moving faster than he had ever moved in his life, tearing through the woods with a singular purpose. The trees became a blur again, but this time, he wasn't running away. He was coming for what was his. Chapter 13. Wood and Iron. The estate of Lady Ingrid was quiet, wrapped in the dark slumber of a house emptied by the festivities. But to Michael, it screamed with presence. He slowed his breakneck pace as he breached the tree line, moving now with the silent, predatory grace of a stalker. His senses were dialed up to their maximum potential, filtering out the smell of the manicured roses and the damp grass to focus entirely on the ribbon of scent that led him away from the main manor. It wound around the side of the property, past the dark windows of the servants' quarters, and ended abruptly at a dilapidated stone annex that looked like a scar on the landscape. Michael approached the structure, his lips peeling back to reveal gleaming white fangs. The scent of bluebells and rain was overwhelming here, pouring from the cracks in the stone like water. But mixed with it was the metallic tang of old rust and the sour note of fear. He crept closer, his massive black form blending with the shadows, until he stood directly before the heavy wooden door. It was an ugly thing, reinforced with iron bands and secured with a heavy deadbolt that looked like it belonged on a dungeon cell. He pressed his ear toward the wood and heard it, the rapid, fluttering rhythm of a heartbeat. It was fast, terrified, and undeniably human. A wave of red-hot rage washed over him, blurring his vision. Someone had dared to lock his mate in this cold, forgotten box. Someone had listened to her howl of misery and done nothing. The beast inside him roared for blood, for retribution, but the man knew that liberation came first. He needed to get her out. He needed to see her. Michael rose onto his hind legs, his body convulsing as he initiated a partial shift. Bones cracked and reshaped, fur retracting in patches to reveal thick, corded muscle and skin. He didn't wait for the transformation to settle. He didn't bother with the lock. He reached out with hands that were still tipped with lethal claws and gripped the edge of the doorframe and the iron bands of the door itself. The wood groaned under his grip, a sound of protest before destruction. With a roar that shattered the stillness of the night, Michael wrenched his arms back. The sound of metal snapping was like a gunshot. The rusted hinges shrieked and failed, the iron deadbolt tore through the rotting doorframe, and the entire heavy oak slab was ripped free from the wall. Michael tossed the door aside as if it were made of paper, sending it crashing into the high weeds with a heavy, final thud. Dust and splinters rained down around him as he stepped into the gaping hole he had created, his silhouette filling the entrance, his chest heaving with the exertion and the overwhelming need to claim what he had found. Chapter 14. Mine. The explosion of the door being ripped from its frame sent Beth scrambling backward, her heels digging into the dirt floor until her back hit the cold stone of the far wall. She covered her head with her arms, curling into a tight ball, certain that a monster had come to finish what her stepmother had started. The noise was deafening, a violent rending of wood and iron that left her ears ringing. Dust billowed into the room, choking the moonlight, creating a thick haze through which a towering figure stepped. Beth lowered her arms slowly, her breath hitching in her throat as she stared at the intruder. He was massive, a silhouette of terrifying proportions backlit by the night sky. He stood amidst the debris of her prison, his chest heaving, radiating a heat and power so intense, it felt like a physical weight pressing against her skin. As the dust settled, the moonlight caught his face. He was in a state of flux, neither fully man nor wolf, his eyes glowing with a feral golden luminescence that pierced straight through the shadows to pin her in place. It was the king. She knew it instantly, though his features were twisted with a raw, predatory intensity that no portrait had ever captured. Michael froze as his eyes landed on the small, trembling figure in the corner. She was covered in grime, her dress torn, her face streaked with the tracks of dried tears. But beneath the dirt and the fear, she was the source. The scent that rolled off her, wild bluebells, rain, vanilla, hit him in a wave that nearly brought him to his knees. The rage that had fueled his destruction of the door evaporated instantly, replaced by a profound, earth-shattering sense of arrival. The missing piece of his soul was sitting right there on the dirty floor. He took a step forward and Beth flinched. The movement stopped him cold. He forced a breath into his lungs, fighting for control, willing his bones to settle and his claws to retract. He needed to be a man now, not a monster. He needed to be a harbor, not a storm. Slowly, deliberately, he crossed the small room, the menace draining from his posture with every step. He dropped to his knees in the dust before her, ignoring the filth that ruined his ceremonial trousers.
"You," he breathed, the words scraping out of his throat, rough with disuse and wonder. He reached out a hand, his fingers trembling slightly as they approached her face. He waited for a heartbeat, giving her the chance to pull away, but she didn't. She stared at him with wide, disbelief-filled eyes. He cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a smudge of dirt. The spark that jumped between them at the point of contact was undeniable, a jolt of electricity that traveled down his spine and settled in his heart. The connection was forged. The search was over. He looked deep into her eyes, letting her see the absolute truth in his own. "Mine," he growled low in his chest. It wasn't a question or a request. It was a recognition of the fundamental law of their existence. Beth felt the word vibrate through her skull, settling into the empty places of her heart. The fear melted away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of safety. She leaned into his palm, closing her eyes as a fresh tear slipped out. "Yours," she whispered back into the silence. Chapter 15. The Return of the King. Michael did not ask if she could walk. He could see the exhaustion etched into the fine lines of her face and feel the tremors still racking her slender frame. He stood up in one fluid motion, sweeping her off the cold floor and into his arms. She felt impossibly light against his chest, fragile as a bird, and the protective instinct in his gut roared to life with renewed vigor. He unclasped the heavy velvet cloak from his shoulders, wrapping it around her to shield her from the night air and the prying eyes of the world. She buried her face in the crook of his neck, her hands gripping his tunic as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning universe. He carried her out of the shattered annex, stepping over the ruins of the door without breaking his stride. He did not head back toward the woods. Instead, he walked with grim determination toward the estate's stables. A groom, dozing by the entrance, scrambled to attention as the massive, disheveled figure of the king approached. Michael didn't need to speak. The look in his eyes was enough to have the man saddling the strongest stallion in the stable with trembling hands. Michael mounted the horse, keeping Beth cradled securely against him, one arm wrapped around her waist while the other gathered the reins. The ride back to the ceremonial hall was a blur of wind and speed. Michael drove the horse hard, driven by a need to place his mate on the highest pedestal the kingdom could offer. He needed to legitimize her, to claim her before the witnesses of the entire court. Beth drifted in and out of consciousness against his chest, the rhythmic galloping of the horse lulling her into a state of surreal peace. She was safe. The nightmare of the locked room was fading with every mile they put behind them. They arrived at the grand hall as the moon reached its zenith. The guards at the main entrance, recognizing the king's mount, threw the heavy double doors open wide. Michael didn't dismount outside. He rode the stallion right up the stone steps and into the vestibule, sliding off only when they were inside the crushing warmth of the building. He gathered Beth up again, ignoring the whispers that hissed through the crowd like steam. He marched into the main chamber. The music died instantly. The laughter ceased. Thousands of eyes turned toward the center aisle, widening in shock at the sight of their monarch, dirty, wild-eyed, and carrying a woman wrapped in the royal colors. Michael looked at no one. He walked a straight line to the dais, the crowd parting before him like the Red Sea. He ascended the steps, his boots heavy on the stone, and approached the obsidian throne he had vacated hours ago in despair. He sat down heavily, pulling Beth onto his lap, settling her against him in a display of absolute, unchallengeable possession. He scanned the room, meeting the gaze of the shocked elders and the gaping nobles. He adjusted the cloak around Beth, ensuring she was covered, before raising his chin in defiance. His voice, when he spoke, boomed through the silent hall, carrying the weight of finality. "The celebration continues," he declared, his hand resting protectively on Beth's back. "My queen has been found." Chapter 16. The Stepmother's Fury Lady. Ingrid stood frozen near the front of the dais, her knuckles white as she gripped her fan, the fragile wood snapping under the pressure of her clenched fist. The scene unfolding before her was a nightmare manifested in flesh and blood. She watched with wide, horrified eyes as the king, the most powerful predator in the realm, cradled the stepdaughter she had locked away in a damp annex mere hours ago. Beth looked wretched, her hair tangled with cobwebs and her face streaked with grime. Yet she was seated on the throne, wrapped in the king's own cloak, elevated above the highest duchess in the land. The sheer impossibility of it made the room spin around Ingrid. Her carefully constructed web of lies, the missing brooch, the locked door, it had all unraveled in a single, catastrophic moment. Around her, the court was buzzing with a frantic energy. Whispers spread like wildfire, carrying words like mate, servant, and destiny. Ingrid could see the pitying glances directed her way by her rivals, and the humiliation burned hotter than fire in her veins. She had spent years reducing Beth to a ghost, a non-entity, ensuring her own daughter, Celia, would shine without competition. Now, that ghost was staring down at her from the seat of ultimate power. Ingrid's mind raced, searching for a salvageable angle. She could not attack the king's mate. That was treason. But she could control the narrative. She had to act the part of the relieved mother, the ignorant guardian who had been frantically searching for her lost ward. Summoning every ounce of her social training, Ingrid forced her rigid features into a mask of overwhelming relief. Tears, practiced and perfect, welled in her eyes as she stepped forward, pushing past a stunned duke. "Beth!" she cried out, her voice pitching up into a theatrical sob of gratitude. She rushed toward the steps of the dais, her arms outstretched. "Oh, thank the moon! We have been looking everywhere for you, child. When you didn't return from the garden, I feared the worst." She moved to ascend the stairs, intent on pulling Beth from the king's lap to comfort her, and to whisper a threat that would silence the girl forever. She made it to the first step before the sound stopped her. It was a low, vibrating rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. King Michael had not moved, but his lip had curled back to reveal gleaming white fangs. The growl was a warning, primal and unmistakable. It froze the blood of every wolf in the hall. Ingrid halted mid-step, her foot hovering in the air, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked up into the king's golden eyes and saw no warmth, only a cold, predatory assessment. "One step closer," Michael said, his voice a quiet rasp that carried more weight than a shout. "And I will forget that you are a subject of this court." He tightened his hold on Beth, pulling the cloak higher around her shoulders. "I smell the deception on you, woman. It reeks of rot and iron. The accusation hung in the silence. Michael didn't need proof yet. His instincts were screaming that this woman was the source of his mate's pain. The scent of old fear on Beth was spiked with the specific chemical signature of the woman standing before him.
Ingrid paled, her hand fluttering to her throat. She realized with a terrifying clarity that her usual manipulations would not work here. This was not a social squabble. This was an apex predator protecting his own. She slowly lowered her foot, retreating backward down the step, her head bowed in forced submission. "Your Majesty, I only meant... I was worried," she stammered, the lie tasting like ash on her tongue. Michael dismissed her with a sharp turn of his head, dismissing her existence entirely, and turned his attention back to the trembling girl in his arms, leaving Ingrid standing alone and exposed in the center of the pitiless court. Chapter 17. The New Reality. The transition from the exposed chaos of the ceremonial hall to the secluded luxury of the royal wing was jarring. Beth sat on the edge of a massive four-poster bed, the silk sheets cool and impossibly soft beneath her fingertips. The room was larger than the entire ground floor of her stepmother's estate, illuminated by the warm glow of a fireplace that crackled with scented wood. Yet, despite the comfort, Beth remained tense. Her shoulders hunched as if she expected the door to burst open and a punishment to be delivered. Old habits, forged in the fires of years of abuse, did not vanish simply because a crown had been placed on her head. King Michael moved around the room with a deliberate slowness, shedding his formal jacket and boots. He seemed to sense her anxiety, dialing back the overwhelming intensity of his presence. He wasn't the raging beast who had ripped a door off its hinges anymore. He was quiet, steady, and grounding. He approached her slowly, kneeling on the rug before her so that he was looking up at her, subverting the power dynamic she was used to. He held out a warm, damp cloth. "May I?" he asked, his voice low and devoid of command. Beth nodded mutely. Michael began to gently wipe the grime from her hands, his touch revered. As he cleaned the soot from her fingers that were calloused from years of scrubbing floors, he frowned slightly, a flash of anger crossing his eyes, not at her but at the life that had hardened her skin. "I frightened you tonight," he said softly, focusing on her palm. "The wolf, he does not have much patience when he finds what he has been hunting." "I wasn't frightened of you," Beth whispered, her voice raspy. It was the first time she had spoken since they entered the suite. "I was frightened that you were a dream. I thought I would wake up back in the annex." Michael stopped, his hands tightening slightly around hers. He looked up, his golden eyes burning with a fierce sincerity. "You will never see the inside of that room again. I swear it on my blood." He paused, a question lingering in his gaze. "How did you do it? The scent. Weeks ago, in the northern ridges. I tracked you, but I never saw you. Why were you there?" Beth looked down, a sad smile touching her lips. "Ingrid sent me. She wanted wild bluebells for the centerpieces. They only grow on the cliffs. She knew it was dangerous. I think she hoped I would slip." She met his eyes. "I was terrified. I was clinging to the rock face, and I smelled you. A storm and deep earth. I hid because I thought a monster was coming." Michael let out a huff of laughter, a dry, incredulous sound. "A monster was coming, but that monster was looking for you." He stood up, lifting her chin with a gentle finger. "You are safe now, Beth, but you must rest. Tomorrow the court will demand to know their queen. Tonight, you just need to be Beth." He pulled the covers back, inviting her to sleep, not as a ruler commanding a consort, but as a man asking his partner to trust him. As Beth lay down, feeling the warmth of the bed seep into her bones, the knot of fear in her chest finally began to loosen, replaced by the first true spark of safety she had felt in a decade. Chapter 18. The Loophole. The library of the High Council was a place of dust and shadows, smelling of ancient paper and secrets. It was long past midnight, But Lady Ingrid was wide awake, pacing the narrow aisle between the towering bookshelves. Her earlier fear had calcified into a cold, hard desperation. She could not lose. Losing meant poverty, it meant ridicule, and worst of all, it meant Beth winning. She would burn the kingdom to the ground before she bowed to the girl who used to scrub her toilets. In the corner, sitting at a small table illuminated by a single flickering lamp, sat Elder Kane. He was a weaselly man with thinning hair and a penchant for gambling, vices that Ingrid had been funding for years. He looked nervous, his hands shaking as he turned to the fragile pages of a leather-bound tome. "Ingrid, this is dangerous," he hissed, glancing at the door. "The king has claimed her. The bond is witnessed. To challenge it now is madness." "The madness is allowing a servant to sit on the throne," Ingrid snapped, stopping her pacing to loom over him. "And you will help me, Kane, unless you want your wife to find out about your debts to the Southern crime syndicates. I have the ledgers, remember?" The elder swallowed hard, his face paling. He returned to the book, flipping pages frantically until he stopped at a section marked with a ribbon of faded red silk. "Here," he whispered, pointing to a block of dense archaic text. "The Luna Trials. It's a pre-unification law, rarely invoked, but technically never repealed." Ingrid leaned in, her eyes devouring the words. The law stated that if a Lycan king chose a mate of common or unverified lineage who had been stripped of rank, the Pack Council could demand a series of trials to prove she was strong enough to hold the position of Luna. It was designed centuries ago to prevent weak leaders from endangering the Pack during times of war. It was brutal, outdated, and perfect. She was stripped of her title when her father died. Ingrid murmured, a wicked smile curling her lips. "By my own decree she is a servant. She has no standing. But the king waives the laws," Kane argued weakly. "The king waives the mating laws," Ingrid corrected, her finger tracing the text. "This is a law of succession and leadership. It falls under the jurisdiction of the council, not the crown. If the council demands it, the king cannot refuse without looking like a tyrant who ignores the safety of the pack." She straightened up, triumphant. "Beth is weak. She has been starved and beaten for years. She will never survive the trials. She will fail, or she will die. Either way, she will be gone." "And if she passes?" Kane asked. Ingrid laughed, a cold, sharp sound that echoed in the empty library. "She won't pass, Kane, because you are going to ensure the tests are adjusted. You are the officiating elder, after all." She placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip tightening like a vice. "Draft the motion. We present it to the court at dawn." Chapter 19. The challenge issued. The morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows of the throne room, casting pools of colored light across the gathered court. The atmosphere was vastly different from the celebration of the night before. The air was thick with tension and curiosity. King Michael sat on the obsidian throne, looking regal and formidable, his hand resting protectively on the arm of the smaller throne beside him. Beth sat there, dressed in a gown of soft cream and gold that Michael had ordered for her. She looked beautiful, but small. Her eyes darted around the room, reading the skepticism in the faces of the nobles. They didn't see a queen. They saw a curiosity, a scandal.
The heavy doors groaned open, and Lady Ingrid strode in. She was flanked by Elder Kane and two other members of the council she had managed to sway with whispered lies about Beth's mental stability. Ingrid did not bow. She walked to the center of the room, her head held high, radiating a toxic confidence. "Your Majesty," Ingrid began, her voice ringing clear, "we come before you with a matter of grave concern regarding the security of the pack." Michael's growl was low and threatening. "The only concern I have is why you are still breathing my air, Ingrid. Speak quickly." Ingrid gestured to Elder Kane, who stepped forward, trembling slightly as he unrolled a scroll. "My king," Kane stammered, avoiding Michael's burning gaze. "It has been brought to the council's attention that your chosen mate lacks the necessary standing and training to hold the title of Luna. As she has lived as a servant for the last decade, We invoke the ancient rite of the Luna Probatio. A gasp went through the court. The Luna trials were legendary for their cruelty. Michael surged to his feet, his fury exploding into the room. "You dare?" he roared, the sound shaking the banners on the walls. "She is my mate. The bond is absolute." "The bond makes her your mate, yes," Ingrid interjected smoothly. "But it does not make her Luna. The Luna commands the armies in your absence. She manages the territory. She must be strong." She turned her gaze to Beth, her eyes filled with mock pity. "Look at her. She is fragile, broken. She would crumble under the first threat. For the sake of the pack, she must prove her worth. Or is she merely a pet you keep?" The insult landed like a slap. Michael looked ready to descend the stairs and tear Ingrid's throat out, law or no law. But before he could move, a soft sound stopped him. Beth stood up. Her legs were shaking, and her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she stood. She looked at Ingrid, really looked at her, and saw not a mother, but a bully terrified of losing control. "I accept," Beth said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried in the silent room. Michael turned to her, shock written on his face. "Beth, no, you do not have to do this. I will burn the law books." "No," Beth said, turning to him. She placed a hand on his chest, feeling the thunder of his heart. "If you protect me from this, they will never respect me. They will always see me as the girl you saved, not the queen who stands beside you." She turned back to Ingrid, her chin lifting. "I am not broken, stepmother. I have survived you for 10 years. A few trials do not frighten me. Bring them on." Chapter 20. The Trial of Spirit. The entrance to the spirit cave was a jagged maw in the side of the mountain, exhaling a breath of cold, damp air that smelled of sulfur and ancient earth. The court gathered at a safe distance, watching in hushed silence. This was the first trial. The Trial of Spirit. It was a test of mental endurance. The candidate had to enter the cave, navigate the labyrinth, and retrieve the moonstone from the center. But the cave was not empty. It was filled with hallucinogenic vapors that drew out a wolf's deepest, most crippling fears. Beth stood at the entrance, dressed in a simple white tunic. She felt Michael's eyes burning into her back, a tangible weight of worry and love. He wasn't allowed to help. Even a whisper from him would disqualify her. She took a deep breath, steeling her nerves, and stepped into the darkness. As she descended, the light from the entrance faded, replaced by a dim, bioluminescent glow from the moss on the walls. The air grew heavy and sweet, cloying in her throat. Almost immediately, the drug took effect. The shadows began to writhe and detach themselves from the walls. Suddenly, she wasn't in a cave anymore. She was back in the attic. The walls were closing in, shrinking until they pressed against her skin. She heard the lock slide home, clack, 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 echoing endlessly. "You are unwanted," a voice hissed. It was her father's voice. She spun around, and there he was, standing in the shadows, his face rotting away. "You let me die. You are weak." Beth fell to her knees, covering her ears. "No," she whimpered. "That's not real." The scene shifted. She was in the woods, clinging to the cliff. But the rocks were turning into Ingrid's fingers, pinching and scratching her skin. Below her, the abyss opened up, filled with laughing faces, Celia, the beta, the king, all mocking her. "Just let go," Ingrid's giant voice boomed from the ceiling of the cave. "You were born to fall." The psychological assault was relentless. The vapors attacked her insecurities, amplifying her trauma until she was curled in a ball on the damp floor, sobbing. She felt small, utterly defeated. It would be so easy to just lie here and let the darkness take her. Then, a sensation cut through the noise. A scent. It wasn't the cloying sweetness of the cave. It was phantom, a memory anchored in her soul. Rain, storm, strength. Michael. She remembered his voice in the annex. Mine. He didn't choose a weakling. He chose her. If the king of Lycans believed she was strong, who was Ingrid to say otherwise? Beth grabbed onto that thought like a lifeline. She forced herself to breathe, pushing past the hallucinations. I am not that girl anymore, she gritted out. She stood up, her legs trembling. She looked at the rotting vision of her father. I loved you, but you are gone. She looked at the giant Ingrid. You are just a bitter old woman. She visualized the bond, the golden thread connecting her to Michael outside. She used it as a compass. Ignoring the screaming voices and the shifting walls, she walked forward. One step, then another. She moved through the nightmare, fueled by a core of steel she didn't know she possessed. She reached the center pedestal, grabbed the glowing moonstone, and turned back. The walkout was a blur of will over fear. When she burst from the cave entrance, gasping for fresh air, clutching the stone, the silence of the crowd was broken by a single, triumphant roar from the king. Chapter 21. The Trial of Blood. The second day of the Luna trials dawned with a sky the color of bruised iron, matching the mood in the training pits. The Trial of Blood was intended to test a Luna's ability to defend herself and the pack, usually a sparring match to first blood against a controlled opponent. However, as Beth stepped onto the sand of the sunken arena, she realized immediately that the rules had been discarded. Her opponent was not a trainer or a guard, but a mercenary from the borderlands, a massive wolf in human form, scarred and missing an ear, holding a weighted bladed staff that was definitely not a practice weapon. Beth stood in the center of the ring, wearing leather sparring gear that felt heavy and foreign on her limbs. She was not a warrior. She had never thrown a punch in her life. Her survival had always depended on making herself small, invisible, and silent. The mercenary, a brute named Goran, grinned at her, his teeth yellow and jagged. He twirled the staff with a whistle of displaced air. Up in the stands, the crowd murmured uneasily. Even the most hardened warriors could see the mismatch. Ingrid sat in the front row, a smug, predatory smile plastered on her face. She had paid Goran a fortune not just to beat Beth, but to maim her, to break her spirit so thoroughly she would never stand again.
The horn blasted, signaling the start. Goran didn't hesitate. He lunged forward with a speed surprising for his size, the staff swinging in a lethal arc aimed at Beth's head. Panic flared hot and white in her chest, but instinct took over. She dropped to the sand, rolling under the swing. The weapon whooshed over her hair, the wind of its passage stinging her ear. She scrambled to her feet, backing away. She couldn't fight him strength for strength. He would crush her like an insect. She had to be faster. She had to be smarter. For 10 agonizing minutes, the fight was a game of cat and mouse. Beth dodged, ducked, and weaved, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Dust coated her tongue, and sweat stung her eyes. Goran was getting frustrated. He was used to opponents who stood their ground, not ones who moved like water. His swings became wilder, angrier, and clumsier. He roared, charging her like a bull, raising the staff high for a crushing overhead blow. Beth saw the opening. Instead of backing away, she stepped into his guard. As he brought the staff down, she dropped to her knees and drove her shoulder into his solar plexus, using his own forward momentum against him. It wasn't a powerful hit, but it was perfectly timed. Goran wheezed, stumbling backward over his own feet. He lost his balance, crashing heavily into the wooden barrier of the arena. The impact jarred the staff from his grip. The weapon spun through the air and landed in the sand at Beth's feet. She snatched it up, spinning it awkwardly but effectively, and pointed the bladed tip at Goran's throat just as he tried to rise. The arena went deathly silent. Goran froze, looking cross-eyed at the blade. By the rules of the trial, he was dead. Beth had the kill. The crowd waited for the thrust, the spray of blood that would prove she was ruthless enough to lead. Beth looked at the man, then up at Ingrid, whose smile had vanished. She looked at Michael, who was gripping the railing so hard the wood was splintering. Slowly, deliberately, Beth lowered the weapon. She tossed it aside. "The pack needs protectors, not butchers," she announced, her voice trembling but clear. "I will not kill a defeated enemy for sport." She extended a hand to help the mercenary up. The crowd erupted not just in applause but in howls of approval. She had shown not just skill, but the true heart of a Luna. Mercy. Chapter 22. The Crumbling Plot. While the arena was still vibrating with the cheers for Beth's victory, King Michael slipped away from the royal box. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. He had seen the way the mercenary swung that staff, with lethal intent. He had seen the nod Ingrid gave the man before the match began. The trials were not just rigged, they were an assassination attempt. He stormed through the stone corridors of the stadium, his guards struggling to keep up with his long, predatory strides. He wasn't going to the locker rooms, he was going to the officiating chambers. He kicked the door open without breaking stride. Inside, Elder Kane was hurriedly stuffing papers into a satchel, looking like a rat caught in a granary. The elder froze as the king entered, the color draining from his face until he looked like a corpse. Michael kicked the door shut behind him and locked it. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the small room. "Your Majesty," Kane squeaked, clutching the bag to his chest. "I was just preparing the certificates for the final trial." "There will be no final trial," Michael said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He crossed the room slowly, letting his alpha aura fill the space. It was a physical weight, a crushing pressure that made the air feel thin and hard to breathe. Kane fell back into his chair, gasping. "I saw the weapon, Kane. I saw the weight in the staff. It was unbalanced, lethal. Who paid for it?" I don't know what you mean," the elder stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. Michael leaned over the desk, placing his hands flat on the wood. He leaned in until he was nose to nose with the trembling man. He dropped the barriers on his wolf, letting his eyes bleed into full, glowing gold. "I am going to ask you one time," Michael growled, the sound vibrating in Kane's bones. "If you lie to me, I will strip you of your rank, your lands, and your skin. Who paid for it?" The Alpha command was irresistible. It bypassed the conscious mind and slammed directly into the elder's submissive instincts. Kane convulsed, fighting the order, but he was weak and corrupt. He broke. "Ingrid," he screamed, sobbing. "It was Lady Ingrid. She has the blackmail files. She forced me. She rigged the selection. She bribed the mercenary. She wanted the girl dead in the ring." Michael straightened up, the glowing gold fading from his eyes, replaced by a look of utter disgust. He snatched the satchel from Kane's hands and dumped the contents onto the desk. There, amidst the official papers, was a ledger, Ingrid's blackmail material, and a signed bank draft transferring a massive sum to the mercenary. It was everything he needed. "Get up," Michael commanded. "You are going to tell the court exactly what you just told me. And then, you are going to pray for mercy." Chapter 23. The Judgment. The great hall was packed to capacity for the announcement of the final trial. The air buzzed with speculation. Beth stood near the dais, tired but standing tall, her confidence bolstered by her victory in the arena. Ingrid stood on the opposite side, looking pale and agitated, her earlier arrogance beginning to fray around the edges. She kept glancing at the side door, waiting for Elder Kane to arrive and announce the final impossible task she had designed, a swim across the frozen lake. The heavy doors banged open, but it wasn't Kane who entered. It was King Michael, dragging the weeping elder by the back of his collar like a misbehaving puppy. He marched down the center aisle, the crowd parting in stunned silence. He threw Kane onto the floor at the foot of the dais and turned to face the assembly, holding the incriminating ledger high in the air. "There will be no more trials," Michael's voice boomed, reaching every corner of the hall. "The sanctity of our laws has been violated." He pointed a finger at Ingrid, who stumbled back, her eyes wide with terror. "This woman has conspired to murder your queen. She has blackmailed a council elder. She has mocked our traditions to serve her own vanity." A roar of outrage went up from the crowd. Ingrid shook her head frantically. "Lies!" she shrieked, her voice shrill and desperate. "He is lying to protect his peasant mate. I demand proof." "The proof is here," Michael said, throwing the ledger at her feet. It skidded across the stone, opening to a page detailing her payments. "And here," he kicked Kane. "Speak." Kane sobbed, pressing his face into the floor. "She made me do it. She rigged the door to the annex. She wanted Beth to fail. She wanted her dead." The truth hung in the air, undeniable and ugly. The court turned on Ingrid instantly. The nobles who had sneered at Beth now looked at her stepmother with revulsion. Ingrid looked around, realizing she was alone. Her allies stepped away, leaving her isolated in a circle of judgment. She fell to her knees, not in repentance, but in defeat. Michael turned to Beth. He drew his sword, not to strike, but to offer the hilt to her. "She is of your house," he said softly. "Her crimes were against you first. The law gives you the right of sentencing, death, exile, or imprisonment. The choice is yours, my queen." The hall went silent. All eyes were on Beth. She looked at the sword, then at the woman who had made her life a living hell for 10 years. Ingrid looked up, tears streaming down her face, pleading silently. Beth felt a surge of power, but also a wave of exhaustion. She didn't want blood, she just wanted peace.
Chapter 24. The Queen's Mercy. Beth did not take the sword. She stepped forward, looking down at Ingrid with a gaze that was not hateful, but filled with a profound, pitying disappointment. "Death is too easy," Beth said, her voice steady. "And exile would only inflict your poison on another land." She took a breath, letting the silence stretch. "You love status, stepmother. You love power. You love your beautiful estate. So you shall keep them, but you will not live in the manor." Beth pointed a finger toward the north, toward the direction of their home. "You will live in the annex. The door will be repaired. The windows will be barred. You will have food and water and books, but you will never step foot outside of those 4 walls again. You will live in the cage you built for me." Ingrid collapsed, wailing. For a socialite obsessed with image, being locked away and forgotten was a fate worse than death. The guards moved in, hauling the screaming woman away. The doors closed behind her, sealing the chapter of Beth's abuse forever. Beth turned to the crowd, searching for a specific face. "Celia!" she called out. Her stepsister emerged from the crowd, looking terrified that she would share her mother's fate. Beth smiled warmly. "And Beta Alaric." The Beta stepped forward, looking hopeful but wary. "My stepmother lied," Beth announced to the court. "There is no betrothal to a Northern Alpha. Celia is free." She looked at Michael, who nodded, understanding her intent. "As my first act as Luna," Beth continued, "I command that a royal wedding be prepared. Not for me, but for my sister and her true mate. Let the kingdom celebrate love that cannot be broken by lies." Celia let out a cry of joy and ran to Beth, hugging her tightly. Alaric joined them, bowing low to his queen, tears in his eyes. The hall erupted in cheers, the tension of the trials dissolving into genuine celebration. Later that evening, Beth stood on the royal balcony, wrapped in Michael's arms. The city below was lit up, music drifting on the breeze. She leaned back against his chest, listening to the steady, strong rhythm of his heart. She smelled the night air, clean, crisp, and free of fear. "Are you happy?" Michael whispered into her hair, kissing her temple. Beth looked at the moon, full and bright above them. She thought of the cold floor of the annex, the hunger, and the loneliness. Then she felt the warmth of her mate, the safety of her position, and the knowledge that her sister was happy. "Yes," she whispered back, turning to press her lips to his. "I am finally home." The king tightened his hold on his queen, and together they watched the sunrise over a kingdom that was finally whole.